Journey Outside by Mary Q. Steele, Chapter 12. Welcome to Chapter 11. He has been left by the strange man who drank from the doban tree, and the man never did answer his questions. So he's on to something else. He headed out to face the wind that has a pungent, strong smell. Chapter 12 in the book called Journey Outside. The wind blew harder, and the colored haze thinned and streamed away in ragged ribbons. Dilar began to run toward the clearer, brighter air he spied in front of him. The wind tousled his hair around his face and made a deep fluttering sound in his ears. After the strange colors of the desert, the countryside into which he was now venturing seemed bleached and pale, with white sand, tan and yellow grasses, and a faded blue sky. Still, Dilar thought it enchanting, and he ran on amazed at how clearly he could see the hillocks of sand around him, and how accurately he could judge distances, and how steadily the horizon held its place. Tall, plumy grasses grew in patches here and there, and once a rabbit jumped from one patch and scampered to the other, startling Dilar so that he dropped his bundle of clothing and had to stop to retrieve it. Birds flew overhead, black and white birds with red bills and gray and white birds with yellow feet, calling to each other in shrill, stuttering voices, like blue-backed creatures with many legs scuttling sideways in front of him. But he did not pause to look at them. He ran on, and when at last he reached the dunes and climbed up to the top, there in front of him lay the windy sea. It was not the first time he had seen the sea. Twice with Dorna he had climbed the mountain behind her house to a point where they could look down on a grape blue sea, could watch the long creamy edge wrinkles of the waves creep toward shore, and see the mysterious deep shadows just below the surface of the water. But he had not known what the sea was like close at hand. He ran down the sliding, shifting heaps of sand and out onto the beach. The green water came toward him, piling up and piling up and piling up until it was too tall to stand any longer, but dropped roaring and tumbling and falling and pounding on top of itself with a thunder that shook the beach and sent the pale froth of its last breath hissing up the sand to die around Dilar's feet. He cried out and ran up and down in amazement, leaping and waving his arms, dizzy with the noise and the fresh, keen smell and the crying birds and the wind. He ran into the water, splashing and kicking. Some of the spray leaped up into his face. He put out his tongue to lick it away from his lips and was startled at the salt taste of it. It had been so long since he had put into his mouth anything but the flat juice and the dull flesh of the doban tree that this sharp savor amazed him. He scooped up some water in his hands and sipped it cautiously. Often on the rafts the water had been faintly salty. Those must have been times when they were near the sea, and the seawater had somehow got into the river, he told himself. Now the bitter tang reminded him that he was on a journey, looking for something. He waded back to shore and picked up his bundle and stood wondering what to do next. He would have liked to stay by the sea for a while. It was beautiful. Something in him rejoiced at the sight of it and the sound of it. He might live here happily the rest of his life if he knew how. But he did not know how. He did not even know how to get anything to eat. Here were no fruit trees, no springs, no bulging pantries, not even a doban tree. There was no sign of another living person, no one to tell him how to live here. Certainly no wise man to answer the questions. He must go on. He set out along the beach, walking on the sand, moistened and packed firm by the hammering waves. Occasionally a shell lay in his path, and he picked up and examined each one. Once he thought he saw a man ahead of him, but when he came closer, he saw that it was a tall gray bird with a plumed head and long legs. It stood in the shallow waves and watched him as he passed. Still there was no sign of other people. So at length he turned inland and climbed the dunes again. After an hour's walk, he came to a scrubby woodland and then some fields with a faint path running across them. He followed the path, and it grew wider and more worn until it was almost a road. There were wooden fences along the way, such as Norna's people use sometimes to confine ewes and lambs, to keep them from wandering up the mountain. But no animals grazed inside these fences. Instead, young green things grew there in odd straight rows. Dilar was puzzled. Someone had put the plants there that way. It was not natural for beans to grow in long lines, but why? And why fence them in? Surely beans did not get up and run up the hillsides, or did they? He leaned over the fence and looked at them uneasily, but they seemed to be fastened firmly in the earth, as most plants were. He came to more woodland. This land, Dilar saw, was not like the land where the people against the tigers lived. The hillsides were steep and the soil thin and rocky, the trees scraggly and small and crooked. Here was no lush meadowland, no riot of bushes and vines bearing fruit and vegetables, no meal of mushrooms, nuts, or berries always by the roadside. Still, it was a beautiful place in its own way. New greenery hung like lace over the scrawny trees and scattered brush, sometimes tinged with red or gold or pink. Patches of tiny yellow and blue flowers grew along the rocks. They seemed to Dilar lovelier and more fragile for growing so bravely out of the poor earth surrounded by dead leaves and bits of rocks and broken twigs. He stopped and got down on his knees to see the bright gold star in the center of the soft petals. The road wound uphill and then down. Dilar came on springs and drank the sweet, fresh water. He was getting very hungry, but there was nothing to eat. By and by he came on more fences, confined their lines of green growing things, and in one of those pens a man was working, chopping away at the earth with a long-handed tool. Though Dilar walked by slowly, the man did not look up. He passed a house and then another house, with a woman washing clothes and a pot in front of it. She saw him and nodded, and he waved back. He wanted very much to ask her for something to eat, but he was afraid. He had never done such a thing and did not really know how to go about it. The sun shone directly overhead. He passed more fields, more houses, and several people who stared curiously at him or smiled but did not speak. At last he came on a man sitting by the roadside eating bread and cheese out of a leather sack. Dilar stopped and waited, and the man grinned and held out some of the bread and a piece of cheese. "Here," he said, "you look hungry. You're welcome to share what I've got." Dilar took the food gratefully and stuffed some of the bread into his mouth. He was so hungry he almost choked swallowing the bread and hardly noticed how it tasted, though it had been so long since he had eaten anything but the flavorless meat of the dough bun tree. "You're a stranger," asserted the man, and Dilar could only nod. The man nodded back, and he said, "If you're seeking your fortune, you've come to the wrong place. Hard work's the only fortune you'll get around here, for there are no riches." Then he laughed. "Ah, but what am I saying? We've enough to eat and some to share with the stranger. That's ample riches." Dilar chewed and swallowed, and then he said, "I have not come to seek a fortune. I have come to find the answer to some questions." The man took the last piece of cheese from his sack, broke it in two, and gave half to Dilar. Then he folded the sack and stuck it inside his shirt. "I hope you find them," he told Dilar. "A question can be as bothersome as a biting fly on a summer's afternoon, but sometimes the answers can be bothersome too. Good luck to you, and now I must get back to work." He climbed over the fence and plodded off between the rows of new plants. "Thank you for the food," called Dilar, and the man raised a hand in acknowledgement, but did not turn around. Dilar had traveled a space farther when the road branched for the first time since he had set foot upon it. One road ran downhill past more fences and farms, and the other, not so well marked, ran steeply up. Dilar hesitated. He should go downward toward the houses and people, he knew, but the sun was hot and the uphill road twisted among trees and gray rocks and seemed somehow more adventurous and inviting. He turned that way and began to climb. He was hardly out of sight of the crossroads before he regretted his choice. The path was steep and difficult to climb. There might not be anyone at all along this road to offer him food and a night's lodging, but then he consoled himself. Since he had no idea where he was going, nor much more of an idea why, it hardly mattered which way he took. The trace had leveled out, was no longer climbing. The sun would set shortly. Dilar looked about, wondering if these woods offered any sort of shelter. There were no habitations as far as he could see, no path other than the one he walked, no fences, no cleared places planted with rows of young potatoes. Ah, well, if he had to sleep on the ground with his cape for cover, he was well used to it. And even on the mountains among the tigers he had not been harmed. Still, there was some daylight, and he trudged on, hoping for a place that suited him more than these open woods. Then he saw a light through the trees, the blaze of a small fire. He left the path and walked toward the light cautiously, and at least he could make out a man's figure hunched on a log by the flames. Dilar stood hesitating. The man simply sat. Across the fire from him several animals moved about, and beyond was a dark shape Dilar took to be a house. Suddenly the man called out impatiently, come on, sit down, don't stand there in the dark, come on. At first Dilar thought he was addressing one of the animals, and then the man turned his head and called again, come and sit down. Slowly Dilar approached the fire. Once again the man was looking away from him, but he patted the log beside him, meaning for Dilar to sit, and then he said, it will be ready soon. Dilar waited a moment, then he asked timidly, what will be ready? The soup, cried the man irritably. The soup will be ready. Oh, said Dilar, there was a pot on the trivet in the fire. That must be the soup. He stared at it hungrily, and then he turned his eyes to the man who sat beside him. The man was old, not so old as grandfather, but older perhaps than Dilar's father, Gymel, older than Wingo. He was rather dirty and scruffy looking, an ugly man with a twisted nose and a scraggly beard and a scar over one eyebrow. The man turned his head and stared at Dilar. Dilar looked quickly away. Embarrassed, he asked, are those antelopes? Nodding at the little horned beast who chewed away at the bushes. Goats, answered the man brusquely. Only goats, stupid creatures. The goats rolled their wicked yellow eyes at one another and grinned gently. Suddenly the man stood up and walked to the door of the hut. He went in, and in a few minutes came out with 2 bowls and a loaf of dark bread. He filled the bowls with the pot and handed one to Dilar. The soup was not rich and thick and flavorful like Wingo's soup, but it was hot and filling, and with the bread made a good meal. When Dilar had eaten, he set his bowl on the ground, spoke his thanks for the supper, and stood up to be on his way. Sit down, bade the man again crossly. Now it's dark. Where would you be going this time of night? Sit down and be quiet, and when he comes, we'll go to bed. When who comes? Asked Dilar, still standing, for he did not like being ordered around so much. My nitty goat, said the man. Out there in the woods, no doubt, if some wolf hasn't eaten him. That's what he thinks. That's what he wants me to think, that he's been half-eaten by a wolf. He thinks I'll cry and be sorry, and then he'll come running up laughing his silly head off. The man spat into the fire. Some day a wolf really will eat him, and then he'll rue the day. He leaned toward Dilar and whispered, he's listening, out there in the brush. I can see his white spots. And he grinned, looking a lot like the goats himself. My name is Vigan, he said suddenly. I have lived here off and on for the lifespans of 3 nitty goats and 4 years of this one. I am Dilar, said Dilar. He frowned. I do not know how long I have lived anywhere. The man laughed. Not long, I could tell that. There was a rustling in the bushes behind him, and he smiled a smile of real affection. Here comes my nitty goat, he said softly. The goat strolled past the fire and toward the hut. It walked proudly and very daintily on small hoof feet, but its horns and beard were fierce. Dilar thought it would take a great wolf to kill and eat such a one. Arg! Cried the man. Fool goat! He sprang to his feet and herded the other goats together and drove them all into a little fenced place behind his house and barred the gate. Now come along, he urged Dilar. It's past my bedtime. It was dark in the little hut. Coals glowed on the hearth, but Vigan lit no candle and did not even stir up the fire. He spread a blanket on the floor and urged Dilar to lie down. Lying there, Dilar watched the coals wink out, heard the old man climb into bed, listening to the goats stamping their feet and the sound of the night bird. He closed his eyes for a second, and when he opened them again, it was morning. Faint daylight came through the open door and the one window, and he could see Vigan kneeling by the hearth, rekindling the fire. He fed it and blew on it and coaxed it, and suddenly flames shot up and made a bright light in the small room. Vigan turned around and looked down at the boy on his pallet and caught his breath in surprise. "Why, you're one of them!" he exclaimed. "One of them! There hasn't been one of them this way in 30 years. Who do you think he means? One of them? Next time we'll be on to chapter 13. What do you mean, them? Asked Dilar in a whisper. Who are them? The raft people, answered Vigan briskly. The raft people, of course. You're one of them, aren't you? Sorry, If you like Journey Outside, you may want to try one of these books on the next 2 slides.